Twice a year, the Chancellor holds a fiscal event. Usually that's a budget in the spring and then an autumn statement later in the year. That's 2 opportunities a year for a Chancellor to change taxation or their spending plans. Now, there are lots of different reasons why a Chancellor might want to adjust their plans. Maybe they want to push forward a long-term agenda for reform, or to set out their party's stall ahead of an election. But one of the most important reasons is to react to news about the state of the economy. The state of the economy and how it will grow over time is inherently uncertain and difficult to predict. So even if a Chancellor never changed their mind about the appropriate level of borrowing, they would still want to adjust their plans as more data about the economy comes in and forecasts get revised. Think of this like a baker making bread dough. You might have a recipe to start with, but as you make the dough, you adjust. If it turns out it's a bit too moist, you put in more flour. If it's too dry, you add more water until you get the right consistency. In our case, if economic news about the future is good, borrowing forecasts might be revised down. Tax revenues might be up, and that means that the gap between revenues and government spending would be smaller. So the Chancellor might be able to cut taxes or top up government spending and still be able to meet their stated goals for borrowing and debt. A good example of this was the autumn statement in November 2023. The new set of forecasts produced by the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, had borrowing running lower than previously expected. So in this chart, the blue bar is the previous forecast, and the light green bar is the forecast the Chancellor was handed by the OBR, a much lower level for the same year. And Mr. Hunt, the Chancellor, decided to spend most of that windfall on tax cuts, pretty much bringing forecasts for borrowing back to where they had been previously. That's the dark green bar. It's almost back to where we started with the blue bar. Now, why does this matter? It matters because when the situation was reversed, he behaved quite differently. A year earlier, in November 2022, he was presented with a deterioration in the forecast. The economic picture had worsened and borrowing was now expected to be higher than previously thought. Let's look at a similar chart as before. The blue bar is the previous forecast, and the light green is the forecast the Chancellor was handed by the OBR. That time, it was much higher. But rather than raising taxes or cutting spending to bring the forecast for borrowing back to the level he had originally planned for, he instead accepted higher borrowing. He let the public finances take the hit. Now, maybe the new higher path for borrowing was what he thought was the best thing for the country. There can always be disagreement about how much government should borrow. But the key issue here is the fact that he responded differently to an improvement compared to a worsening. This matters for the accuracy of forecasting. It means that borrowing is much more likely to end up higher than forecast and very unlikely to end up lower than forecast. He is not alone in this. Last year, we did some work analyzing the decisions of chancellors since 2010 and found that their behavior generally followed the same pattern. When things got worse and forecasts for future borrowing were revised up, they allowed it to rise. They did not take action to counteract this development and bring borrowing back to the previously forecast path. But when things got better and borrowing was revised down, they did not allow borrowing to fall. Instead, they spent most of the windfall and brought borrowing back to its previously forecast path. So in other words, chancellors tend to spend the proceeds of good news, but to shrug their shoulders when bad news comes along. This has 2 undesirable consequences. First, it makes life harder for the OBR, the government's official forecaster, and means that official forecasts systematically understate the level of borrowing that's actually likely to occur. Second, it acts as a ratchet, pushing borrowing and debt higher and higher. For this reason, the UK public finances are probably in a worse state than official forecasts suggest.